for a start, okay, this is the River Runners Oral History Project, and we're here on the Stanton Photo-match trip, and it's September 11th, 1994. We're here with Gene Shoemaker, and maybe just for starters, if you just tell us who you are and how you ended up on this trip.
Okay, well, I'm Gene Shoemaker. I've been working around on the Colorado Plateau since 1948, and I've had a long-lasting love affair with green and Colorado rivers, starting in 1949. Went down with some friends down Glen Canyon, and then later on just boated on the river recreationally all over on the river system. But the thing that led to my being on this trip was a project I undertook in 1968. It was a project that I had dreamt about doing from 1954 when William Culp Darrah published the first biography of John Wesley Powell. And it was a good biography, and in this book Darrah mentioned the pictures that had been taken on the second Powell expedition, and I decided right then and there that it would be a wonderful project to go back and find the camera stations of those Powell photographs, or the photographs taken by the photographers with Powell. And I kind of had in mind, well, it would be something I'd do when I retired. But in 1967, late 1967, I got home from a trip back to Flagstaff and read the hometown paper, the Daily Sun, and discovered there that the U.S. Geological Survey and the Smithsonian Institution and the National Geographic Society were going to plan a centennial celebration of Powell's first trip down the river in 1869. And I made up my mind right then and there, now is the time to do that project. And I promptly invited myself on the organizing committee and approached the director of the Geological Survey and was able to get support to undertake a summer's-long trip in 1968, starting in Green River, Wyoming, and ending at the Grand Wash Cliffs, or more exactly at Pierce Ferry, where we went down to try to recapture all of the camera stations that we could from the beginning of the second Powell expedition through to the end. And so I started out with Hal Stevens, who's my primary partner in this, and Stevens was to be the photographer on our trip, and I took the detailed notes of each site, and we jointly located sites. And we organized the trip in 6 sections. So the first one was from Green River, Wyoming, down to the canyon, the dam site, which would be the first pull-out point. And then we started again with some addition to the crew, and I had a group that joined me from Denver that called themselves the Powell Society. Various members of the Powell Society then joined Stevens and I on various parts of this trip, on each of the 6 segments, and they were going to prepare guidebooks, geological and historical guidebooks to the river system.
If you excuse me, I'm sorry. Put these back. This is
See if it's coming through all right.
okay. That's good.
Okay. All ready?
Yeah.
So the trip lasted about 3 months. We did indeed start off from exactly the same point that the Powell party started on their second expedition. Of course, we knew where it was because we had the photographs. In fact, we photographed a number of sites around the town of Green River, recaptured some of the sites that E.O. Beeman, who was the initial photographer, had taken. Of course, a number of the sites as we went down were covered under Flaming Gorge Reservoir, backed up behind Flaming Gorge Dam. I'd seen the river before the dam was put in, but we were able to locate fairly closely a whole series of those sites. And then, of course, below Flaming Gorge Dam, we then had the open river again, down through Red Canyon, Browns Park, down into Lador Canyon. And indeed, the second Powell expedition took a lot of photographs up in that part of the trip. They became somewhat more sparing of photography as they went further downstream. So a second segment, then we took the boats out at Dinosaur National Park and put them back in again at the head of Desolation Canyon, actually at the Ouray Indian Reservation. And then it was the third leg of the trip actually was from there on down to Green River, Utah. And then we had another group join us, and we hopscotched. Then the next segment was down through Stillwater Canyon, Cataract Canyon. And in fact, Tad Nichols and his son-in-law Erling, came up and met us by boat. By that time, the reservoir was already getting pretty high behind Glen Canyon Dam, and gave us a tow on out to the new site of Height. But we did get some interesting Powell sites, actually, somewhat up out of the riverbank, some Indian ruins that they had photographed, and some interesting inscriptions of the Powell party, actually, on the rocks, which is now underwater. And then we had to just portage around Lake Powell and put the boats back in at Lee's Ferry. So the real reason I'm on this part of the trip is, of course, we continue that work on down through Grand Canyon. It turned out that Beeman left the party, the Powell party, midway through the 1871-72 trip. Powell and his crew wintered over in Kanab, Utah, and Beeman had a falling out with Powell, so Powell bought out Beeman's share of the photographs and the equipment, hired a new photographer out of Salt Lake City, who actually did go back out. They had cached one boat at the mouth of North Wash, and the party went overland and discovered the Escalante River. This was on horseback. Thompson was in charge of that, and they went back and recovered the boat that was cached there with a complete set of photographic gear. And so they took pictures coming down Glen Canyon the following spring. But the photographer that Powell had hired really wasn't physically up to it. He was fairly sick. In the meantime, he had succeeded in training John Hillers, whom Powell had hired in Salt Lake City as an out-of-work mule skinner, and had become a boatman on the trip, and who had just picked up photography and been trained a little bit along the way of the trip, and he turned out to be a superb photographer. So the rest of the photographs taken down through the Grand Canyon, down through here, were taken by Hillers instead of Beeman. So we spent about a month starting at Lee's Ferry, taking out at Pierce Ferry, recovering Hiller's camera stations all the way down through Marble Canyon and on down through the Grand. Actually, the Powell party took out in the summer of 1872. They didn't go all the way through. They stopped at Kanab Creek. They had a supply party coming in on horseback from Kanab that brought supplies down to the river. They were going to resupply, but the river was so much higher than Powell had seen it in 1869 that he decided that the better part of valor was to abandon the river at that point. Mm-hmm. So Hillers took a series of pictures going up Kanab Creek, which we did follow out on foot for about 8 miles up Kanab Creek, and then that was about as far as the remaining pictures go. It turns out that during the winter encampment at Kanab, Hillers had gone down with Powell's cousin and scrambled down from Torowheat Valley and gotten down to Lava Falls. So there were a series of Hillers pictures that were taken at Lava Falls, even though the second expedition didn't actually make it to the lava falls in the river. We had a very nice sequence to recover there. So that was about as far downstream as we had photographs to recover on that second expedition.
I hate to do this, but I gotta get these on again too. It's too bright. Okay. Well, how valuable is photo matching to the GS and stuff? What do you guys get from matching these things?
Well, we were basically the first persons, Stevens and I, to go back and do this kind of thing.
You mean nobody had thought of that?
Nobody had ever gone back and really tried to match photographs. It soon became a popular sport. A lot of people got into going back and looking at old photographs and matching the sites to see what the changes were. And I had two objectives in this work. One of them was simply to develop a good descriptive album of the beautiful work that Hillers and Beeman did. They deserved to be recognized as pioneer photographers of the West. And while Jackson and O'Sullivan and others had gotten quite a reputation, there had never been a systematic publication of the photographs from the second Powell expedition, which was really pioneering work. So my first objective was really to publish these photographs and get them known to the public, and to do it in a way that would describe what's there, and to give these pioneers credit for what they had done. We intended the book to be out in time for the Powell Centennial, but what happened was that I left the full-time employment with a survey in the end of 1968. I went to Caltech, and while we had all the photographic material ready and the maps, there just wasn't time to bring it all together. And so finally the book was published after Stevens retired, and he had the time to sit down and kind of finish pulling it all together. So we didn't make that one objective of getting the work out for the Powell Centennial, which is an initial intent. The second intent, of course, was I was hoping to learn something about the nature of the changes in this country. And I had no idea what we were going to discover, because no one had really ever done it before. And it's kind of an ideal place coming down through the canyons of the Colorado Plateau, because it's perhaps one of the least disturbed areas. That is, if you exclude the dams and all now, the areas that have not been affected by the dams, it's one of the least disturbed areas left in the conterminous United States. So you see what, my idea was to try to understand something about the rates of geologic processes, the rates of change on the riverbank or in the side canyons or on the canyon walls. And what I found was a surprise, frankly. We found that in 85% of the cases when we went back and located a scene, there was hardly any change at all, either in the background or in the foreground. Small rocks on steep slopes were still in the same place. Cobbles on the riverbank were in the same place. That was a big surprise in most cases. And it was only in the remaining 15 to 20% of the cases that we actually saw changes. And what was really interesting was there were very few intermediate cases where there were just a few changes. Either the whole foreground scene was changed, or there was hardly anything disturbed, with just a few cases where, we say, one or two rocks had been moved, something like that. So that brought home to me that the nature of geologic processes that sculpture these canyons, and for that matter, sculpture all of the landscape, is such that very little happens over most of the time. Most of the change takes place in very rare events, They will be flash floods on the main river. There will be debris flows on the side streams, or a section of the cliff falls off. And at any one place, the change is basically catastrophic. Nothing happens for hundreds of years, or sometimes even for 1,000 years, and then there'll be a catastrophe, a local catastrophe that changes the landscape. And actually, I think we're coming to understand now that that's the way most geological processes work, geomorphic processes. That the processes are dominated by the rare several hundred-year flood or 1,000-year flood, and not by the annual events or the decadal events, which has been kind of the view that's been embedded in the consciousness of geologists since Lyell published his book on the principles of geology. There was a view that you could go and sit on the bank of a stream and see what was doing the work, on an average day, and it's not true. Very little happens on the average day. It's that one rare day in 100,000 in which most of the geological change occurs. So that was kind of a revelation from that book. And that preceded, of course, the work that's now ongoing, the beautiful, detailed studies that are being carried out by Jack Schmidt and Ted Mellis and Bob Webb. Way they've gone back now and looked at many, many other sets of photographs, more extensive photographs like Stanton's collection, for example, and have turned these photographs as a beautiful scientific resource for really understanding the frequency of these kinds of events in the canyon.
How are the Stanton photos? How do they compare with, say, Hiller's or Beeman's?
Oh, I think Stanton took a very good set of photographs too, and they were much more extensive, of course, in the Grand Canyon by an order of magnitude over what Hiller's took, because he was trying to document the route of his proposed railroad. So the Stanton collection, I don't know the exact number, it's of order of 1,000 photographs or so. It's vastly more extensive data, and of course dates back again to the late 19th century. So there's now been a century since Stanton's time. So they actually provide more detailed scientific information than was available from the Powell photographs. But the basic story was there in the Powell photographs. And if you take the photographs not just from the Grand Canyon, but for the whole river system, right on up through the Green, all the way back to Green River, Wyoming, you have a pretty good sample of the Colorado Plateau in those photographs.
And I guess these Stanton photos, are they telling us kind of the same thing? I mean, that's what these guys are finding matches what you got.
Somewhat to my surprise, when I just looked at the frequency of changes from the Powell pictures, my estimate was that at any one place, something catastrophic happens on order about once every 500 or 1,000 years. Somewhat to my surprise, they're finding from the Stanton photographs and from more recent photographs now that in some of these side canyons, the frequency of flooding and serious flooding and debris flows is much higher than I would have guessed. So in some cases, there have been multiple debris flows, such as at Prospect Canyon, in the course of less than 50 years. And that, of course, I would have had no way of knowing with the small coverage that we had from the Powell photographs. But I guess I am surprised. I still think that in any given place, if you look at these really enormous debris fans that we see, there are occasionally huge floods, which I think are of the order of once every 1,000 years, that build a major fan. And then you have what happens is you have smaller debris flows in between time that make small modifications to that. But the truly big fans in this section of the canyon probably are built with a frequency of about once every 1,000 years or so.
Had you have you ever worked with the Bureau Reclamation before, or had much experience with them?
No, I've had no experience with the Bureau Reclamation. No.
Like this trip is your first.
This is my first formal association with the Bureau Reclamation.
What do you think of this trip and the Stanton Photo-match project? What's that say for the Bureau that they're doing that?
Well, I think that the support that the Bureau has put into research to understand the changes happening in the canyon, both those which happen naturally without the presence of Glen Canyon Dam, as well as the direct effects of the dam on the river, and these two kinds of changes, of course, have an interplay with one another. I think that's far-sighted, and it's important. I'm truly delighted to see the Bureau supporting this kind of work. And it's providing an opportunity to do science of this kind in a detail that's never been done before. We are really going to understand how these canyons evolve thoroughly for the first time out of that work. So I have to tip my hat to the Bureau of Reclamation for the vision to support this work.
So your first trip through here was your first trip through here was 68 then, right, when you were doing the Powell match. But you started boating in the 50s.
I started boating in 1949, and just with friends, you know, we'd go and run Cataract Canyon or the San Juan or up through Flaming Gorge. In fact, we spent some time kind of getting around and making sure we ran through all the canyons before they disappeared under reservoirs. So we, for example, went back down the San Juan and the lower part of Glen Canyon the year just before the canyon was closed with the construction of the dam. Say a last goodbye to it. So I but this was just recreational. You know, it was not professional boating. Something I just did as a vacation. But working on the Colorado Plateau, of course, I knew the geology intimately over a broad area. And that's, of course, what made it possible. Having seen all the canyons and the upper part of the river system and knowing the geology is really what made it feasible to do that 1968 trip and know where to look and get all the pictures sorted out. It turned out that the photographs were not very well identified. The photographs from the second Powell expedition had the plates, these are wet, the old classical wet plate photographs, had gone into the USGS collection and had never been systematically cataloged. There had been an album of prints made from these plates, but it was all mixed up with other things. And it was something that was done in Jack Hiller's lab. Jack Hillers went on to become the chief photographer for the USGS when the Powell survey was amalgamated with the other surveys in 1879. And so Hillers had those plates, and they were just part of the survey collection. And I would judge it was probably about 20 years after the trip that someone sat down and tried to identify and say, oh yeah, this picture was from here and that was from there. My hunch is that Thompson did it, but I'm not sure. And Thompson was really the guy who was basically in command of the river trip most of the second Powell expedition, because Powell himself was off making trips back to Salt Lake City and working on logistics and things. And most of the captions were reasonably close, but you couldn't tell for sure where they were. In some cases, they had the pictures on the wrong river.
Oh my.
So it was a task to sit down and figure out
where these were.
Where were these photographs? So that was a first order kind of piece of detective work. And having done all the previous boating on the rivers was a good head start to finding these things. There was one picture. We went back to the National Archives, which is where those plates are now, and had copies made that we then used to both to make prints to work from, but also to prepare the final prints for publication. And there was one plate in there. We had the print, and I looked at it, and I just couldn't figure out where this picture could have been on the second Powell expedition. It kind of looked like the San Juan River to me, but I wasn't sure. We got all the way down and never saw it. And later I discovered the picture had been published in Jackson's book of Jackson's pictures. It was by W.H. Jackson, and not by Hillers or Beeman. So there were those kinds of mix-ups in the collection at that time. So it was kind of a fun challenge, actually, to find those pictures. And we didn't know how tough it would be, but it turned out we hit our schedule right on the nose. And there were a few we didn't catch. We'd realized we'd gone past them too late. So there were just a few in that case, and we lost a couple prints in the river when we were running through a rapid or something. But we recovered most of the existing pictures. Actually, there's a story about that collection itself that most people don't know. During the late 1930s, there was an edict that went out that the government had to reduce its files. And so a decision was made that the collection of negatives was going to have to be reduced in the USGS photo lab. And believe it or not, they actually removed, presumably destroyed, some of the plates, original plates from the Powell expedition. Now, the man that made that decision was Julian Sears, who was the assistant director at the time. I have a hunch those plates still exist somewhere. I can't imagine they broke them and threw them away.
That's crazy.
But we did have prints. We at least had the prints, even if original negatives were gone. Yeah. And some of the pictures that we've published are just from those prints. The original plates don't exist anymore.
Some of those are really nice. Well, how old do you think the canyon is? Do you think it?
Well, I have very strong prejudices about that because I've worked in the upper end of the system, in particular the Little Colorado River Valley, and worked on the Betahoche Formation. And I'm confident that there was a through-flowing stream going west or northwest across the Kaibab uplift in Miocene time. But it was not connected to the lower part of the canyon, that's clear. The lower part of the canyon cannot be much older than about 4 million years. But there was the beginning of the cutting of the river as it crosses the Kaibab uplift. The nose of the Kaibab Plateau is much older, I think. And I think there was an integrated drainage system. There was a Colorado River system with its tributaries that was probably here on the plateau, sort of in the configuration you see now, going all the way back to the beginning of Oligocene time, about 30 million years ago. But the river clearly didn't go out through where the lower Colorado does now. It must have crossed over I believe, over the Basin Range province and emptied to the Pacific, somewhere along about the latitude of Northern California now. That's still an open story. But the upper part of the Colorado was then captured by the lower Colorado, working up from the Gulf of California, which is a new feature, is a very young feature geologically, in the last 4 million years.
What turned you toward astronomy?
Well, I got into astronomy kind of through the back door. I was interested in the idea of going to the moon. In fact, this idea kind of came to me rather suddenly in 1948, shortly after I joined the Geological Survey. I had been a student at Caltech, and I was familiar with the development of rockets that had been going on at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and that they were flying these rockets as upper stages on the captured German V-2s. Well, I just got to thinking about that. You know, they're going to go to the moon in my professional lifetime. They're going to send human beings to the moon. And I made up my mind right then and there I was going to be trying to stand at the head of the line when the time came for when scientists were chosen to be sent as lunar explorers. Well, this was, of course, 10 years before NASA was founded. And I just simply took those turns in the road that I thought would lead me to being the best prepared field geologist to go study the moon. And I had an opportunity to go and study Meteor Crater, Arizona. I had been working on volcanic craters in the Hopi Buttes, which in fact have forms that are rather similar to some of the smaller lunar craters. And I thought I ought to be working on impact craters as well. And so I did seize that opportunity. And of course, having worked on an impact crater, the first kind of question a geologist asks is, well, how often does this kind of thing happen? What's out there? What kind of bullets are out there that hit the Earth that make craters? So I immediately made it my business to find out about what was known about Earth-crossing asteroids at the time, and there wasn't a lot. In fact, there were about 8 of them known at the time I worked on Meteor Crater. In fact, most of them have been lost. Only a few of them had well-determined orbits. In the meantime, the lunar program did come along. As it turned out, I didn't become an astronaut because my adrenal cortex failed just a couple years before scientists were chosen. And I ended up chairing the National Academy's ad hoc selection committee instead of being one of the guys standing in line. But that was a reason for getting deeply into studying the geology of the moon, and I started a lunar geologic mapping program in the U.S. Geological Survey, funded by NASA. And we continued the study of craters, and it was important to study craters to be able to interpret what we were seeing on the moon, of course. So my first involvement with telescopes was actually in working on lunar geology, because we had to go to the telescope to get higher resolution than was available in even the very best telescopic photographs that we could work from. And in fact, I had a telescope built near Flagstaff on Anderson Mesa, where we carried out part of that program of observations to work out the critical details for unraveling the stratigraphy of the lunar surface. So that was sort of my first direct involvement with telescopes. Later, when I went to Caltech to become the chairman of the Division of Geological and Planetary Sciences, I hired a young woman to work with me by the name of Eleanor Helene, and I set her on the task of tracking down every scrap of information we could find about the discovered Earth-crossing asteroids. That seemed an opportunity to work on that problem. It turned out there were only 13 that had been discovered by that time, all of them just accidentally. And we finally decided that the best way to get any further knowledge is to go search for them ourselves. And so I started a program. Helene actually carried out most of the observations with a small Schmidt telescope on Palomar Mountain, where time was available to do the work. It turned out to be an ideally suited telescope for the work. So being at Caltech was an important step in having been able to start that. And that started in 1973, and this year will basically be our last year of work on that telescope. So it's work that's been carried on over a period of more than 20 years.
It's hard to fathom all that stuff going on out there, or just to think about trying to figure out, trying to see what's going on as far out there as Jupiter. I guess your comet really made a big bang when it hit. I had read that article in Time magazine, but I didn't follow up on when it actually hit.
The comet did its thing at Jupiter.
Yeah.
Of course, all these years, I've kind of had a daydream. It would sure be fun to see a real impact in my lifetime. they're rare enough that odds of that weren't very high. Of course, I rather imagine maybe there'd be a small asteroid that would hit the Earth maybe deep in the outback of Australia where nobody'd get hurt, and I'd rush over and map the crater. If I'd really thought about it, I would realize if I were going to see any impact of a comet or an asteroid during my lifetime, the most likely case would be Jupiter, because the frequency of impact on Jupiter exceeds the frequency on any other planet. It's because it's bigger, because it has a very large gravitational field of influence, so it focuses the flux of comets onto it. But I hadn't gone all the way through that calculation. This was really kind of a daydream, you know. So it was a matter of extraordinary good fortune that we actually discovered a comet in 1993 in March. First of all, it was broken up. It had gotten so close to Jupiter, it had been pulled apart in Jupiter's gravitational field. And then we learned with further tracking by many observatories around the world that this object was in orbit around Jupiter. And then finally it became clear it was going to actually hit Jupiter when it came next back to its closest approach to Jupiter. That was all just an incredible series of surprises. And then, of course, we were trying to figure out, well, what's really going to happen? Many people worked on this problem, and there was a wide range of opinions. Some people said, oh, we're not going to see anything at all. Those comets are going to disappear without a trace. I was pretty sure we were going to see some results that we could resolve with the telescope. In fact, with colleagues, we obtained calculations of the plume that's produced by the hot fireball generated by the impact, and how high it would rise and how long it would take and how far it would spread out. And those calculations were finished only about a week before the first impact. It would have been sooner, but we had trouble getting the funding to do the work. Finally, the National Science Foundation decided, well, gee, I'd been one of the co-discoverers of the comet. It was kind of a shame if they didn't give us a little funding to work on it, too. So we finally got our calculations done late, but I was absolutely delighted because the first nucleus that hit Jupiter produced a plume that we could see on the limb, on the edge of the planet, with the Hubble Space Telescope images. It was very close to the plume that we'd calculated. So at that point, I knew we were really going to see something.